All right, so once again, welcome to the Paris Agreement Alignment Session, or PAA FAQs, as part of the Resilience Learning Month. So we've been having different special knowledge sharing events. So this is part of the ADB Resilience Learning Month, and this is actually the last event for the RLM month. So thank you so much for joining us for this session. We will be having two speakers. Our first speaker is Christian Ellerman. He's a senior climate change specialist. He's the focal for climate investment funds and Green Climate Fund. And he also leads the work stream for Paris alignment here at ADB. Our second speaker is Audrey Jung. She's a climate change specialist, and she's the climate change focal of the sectors group for water and urban, for transport and energy, primarily adaptation. So we'll be hearing from them an overview of what Paris alignment is and how we are operationalizing it here at ADB. And we'll also hear some insights, lessons learned, and things that we can do moving forward. Without further ado,
actually, one quick ado from my side, Ryan. So since we have quite an audience here, but for us to adjust to your background and experience, can we just get some hearts, thumbs up if you feel you've had a lot of interaction on Paris alignment already, and otherwise no reaction? We can just see some thumbs up or hearts, then we know how many of you have worked or have encountered Paris alignment in projects or in your work upwards. These are the reaction buttons in your Teams. Not seeing any. Okay, so I have to assume all newbies to Paris alignment, which is fantastic. So thanks very much for joining today. I do assume that probably some of you have seen similar presentations on Paris alignment before, but it's a very good opportunity to speak to you. Speak with you, in fact, since this is a FAQ. It's meant to be interactive and really responsive to any questions you may have. We have set this up as an overview on the work of on Paris alignment, but then also questions that in FAQ format that we've gathered throughout the months and years. But we very much welcome you to come in with your questions. We have an hour, and so we will limit the intro part to the most necessary part. Very good. We can go to the next slide to just kick it off. Oh, it's loading. Next, further. All right. So in any case, we embarked as ADB onto our Paris alignment journey sometime after the Paris Agreement, obviously. We built some notions of the Paris Agreement into some strategic documents at ADB. This follows the 2015, end of 2015 approval of the Paris Agreement, where all of our ADB's member countries are party to the agreement. And that's important to keep in mind. ADB is not a party to the Paris Agreement since it's only nation states, but all of our member countries are, and therefore some of the commitments that countries have made there have impacts on our. Go to the next slides. We have in the following 2-3 years after the Paris Agreement, worked with the MDBs very closely to come to a common understanding among us of what Paris alignment, of aligning with the Paris Agreement means for the MDBs. And this is because there's no definition in any of the UN agreements on what Paris alignment would mean, but there are requirements, in this case for the Paris Agreement, to mitigate climate change, limit greenhouse gas emissions and global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. There's also commitments by all countries to increase adaptation financing and the resilience and adaptation capacity of countries. And then third in that line is to make finance flows compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's where we took the initiative then to look at the MDBs and how we work and what role we play in the whole ecosystem of finance, to define what are the principles, the key building blocks of our work around Paris alignment. Among us, we came up with an approach that defines 6 building blocks to operationalize Paris alignment in the MDBs. The first 2 here, and we won't go into much detail on many of them, but to mention them here, the first 2 concern operations, so new ADB operations in our case, and their alignment with the mitigation goals of the Paris Agreement and the alignment with the adaptation goals and climate resilient operations. So those are the ones that you will see as being implemented in our, for example, our climate change assessment and the Paris alignment assessment that we do on each operation. But that's not the entire story, although for operational and processing purposes, it often is the entire story. But the broader notion of Paris alignment also entails building block 3, meaning accelerating access to climate finance. So translated to what it means for ADB, it means scaling up our climate finance, making sure that we have our countries, our developing member countries, access to global climate finance sources and increase the co-financing and private sector leverage for climate purposes in our operation. So ramping up the amount of money that goes to climate in DMC. Building block 4 is around engagement and policy development support. So that means we don't limit ourselves to get what we finance right, but we also support countries to develop their climate plans, whether that be mitigation or adaptation focused ones, in their nationally determined contributions and their long-term strategies or national climate policies of any shape or form across mitigation and adaptation. Improve them for financeability, raise their ambition, etc. So that's some very important upstream kind of work that we have a whole team in ADB working on. Then there's a building block among the MDBs on reporting on what we do on the Paris alignment. And 6, last but not least, is aligning our internal activities. So that means getting our own house in order and, for example, reducing emissions from headquarters, from travel, from our procurement, etc. So this is kind of the whole spectrum of things that we work on Paris alignment, but we'll zoom in a little bit more in detail onto what's operationally relevant for new projects, meaning building block 1 and building block. Before we go into that detail, linked to that, we since a couple of years ago have the commitment by our top management that ADB will align all of our sovereign operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement by July last year. And at that time, our non-sovereign operations to 85%, and fully also aligned by July 2025. We were successful in rolling out the whole machinery of assessing our operations, making sure each operation is assessed. Since the beginning of the year, also all operations assessments are being transparently published as part of the climate change assessment for sovereign operations. And in fact, since 1st of July 2023, all of the approved operations, new operations of ADB, have been assessed for Paris alignment and have been found to be Paris aligned. So even though we had some leeway with regards to our non-sovereign operations, these have also all been aligned since the start. To go into a little bit of detail what that means, the important part is that to be considered aligned with the Paris Agreement, we need to assess each operation, each project, from both the mitigation and the adaptation goal. That doesn't mean that they all need to be mitigation and adaptation projects, but we have to check that they are compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement, both from the mitigation and the adaptation side. So in practice, that would mean that a operation that has no impact or does no harm to the mitigation goals is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Likewise, a project that is resilient to the impacts of climate change and does not contradict the adaptation plans of the country of implementation is aligned with the adaptation. As such, it's a dual target, and each project has to be assessed and confirmed for both. In terms of mitigation, the key notions to keep in mind are the operation has to be consistent with the climate plans of the country. So what the operation does cannot contradict the climate plans of the country, whether they are outlined in the NDC or the LTS, so Nationally Determined Contribution or Long-Term Strategy. It also, each operation must be compatible with transition pathways to low carbon development and must not entail risks for stranded assets. So those are the kind of the three key points to keep in mind as the high level, macro level points, consistent with the country plans and compatible with the global pathways towards 1.52 degrees, in particular, considering the transition risks and risks for stranded assets that projects may entail. In practice, how we implement that at ADB and in the MDB methodology, we follow that quite closely, is that we work with a set of two broad lists. One is the universally aligned list 1, and the other one is the universally not aligned list, UC2. So anything that's on the first list, that's a list of a compendium of project types that would, under all circumstances, be compatible with, consistent with country pathways, not entail transition risks, be compatible with decarbonization pathways, and not entail stranded asset risks. So if you're on that, if all the operations are on that list, it would be automatically aligned. If any one of components or all your components are not on that list, that doesn't mean it's not aligned. It just means it has to go through a specific assessment regarding these points: consistency with country plans and global decarbonization pathways, avoidance of transition risk, and risk of stranded assets. At the same time, there's a universally not aligned list currently containing coal and peat, both in terms of mining and power generation from it. If any of your components is on that list, then it's automatically not aligned. You don't even need to go through specific assessment anymore, but we wouldn't be able to consider such a project personally. So that means that a certain amount of projects, and in our experience, say it's 50% or so, maybe even more.
More than 50%.
More, yeah, so more than 50% of our projects would be universally aligned. If you think of your electromobility project, of your renewable energy project, of say schools or hospitals that don't use fossil fuels to heat them, then you're easily immediately aligned, and otherwise the remaining, say, 40% or so of projects in our experience go through the specific assessment. That was BB1, building block 1, mitigation. Now turning to adaptation. The approach is slightly different. And it's the good thing for ADB is that we had a very strong climate risk assessment and climate risk management approach already, which largely mirrors what we have to do for Paris alignment from an adaptation perspective. So we, in principle, just rely on our climate risk and vulnerability screening and assessment, meaning the first step of both of these, Paris alignment and climate risk assessment, is looking at the operation and establishing the risk of the project to climate change impacts. That, in our practice, comes out with a low, medium, or high ranking. If there's low or immaterial risks only, you can skip the second step. If, as how many percent of operations are medium or high risk? Can we roughly say that?
I can say 50%.
50%. I would have thought even more because I mean, climate risk is a high occurrence in Asia, in our region. But in any case, if the climate risk assessment comes out as medium or high risk, the project goes into a step also in our climate risk management process to define measures to mitigate these climate risks. And so this step in Paris alignment would check that we have taken and are implementing all relevant measures to mitigate the identified climate risk. Once you've done that, this is an additional step for Paris alignment, would still have to check that what you're doing in this operation, in this ADB project, does not contradict or is inconsistent with any of the adaptation and resilience plans of the country. We've not found this to be a big stumbling block or a stumbling block at all for the large majority of our. So if you go through this flow, your project will be considered Paris aligned from the adaptation perspective, and if it's also aligned earlier from a mitigation perspective, then we would consider it a project. This is the process for direct investment operations. There's a separate process for financial intermediation and policy-based lending, as well as for general corporate purpose financing. So these are all types of operations where the use of proceeds or exactly where the money goes isn't identifiable upfront. And so it relies more on the overall objective of the project in the case of PBLs and in looking at the client intermediary, for example, in the case of the ISO call. Not going to go into any detail. Moving on.
Yes. Thank you, Christian, for that general overview of the Paris Agreement alignment over at ADB. Now, in a few minutes, we'll be hearing from Okju Jung to also listen to her insights. But before that, let's do a one FAQ. So, Christian, we have one. This is our first frequently asked question. Do all operation types need to be assessed? How about TA, small expenditure financing facilities, and project readiness finance? Christian?
Right. No, yeah, thanks. And that's indeed something we get asked very often. First of all, without answering the question, I would like to point you to our internal Paris alignment guidance. We have, based on the MDB methodology for Paris alignment, developed a detailed Paris alignment guidance note that took a long time to develop. We worked very closely with all the relevant sector groups and other parts of the bank to provide more specific guidance, more detailed guidance that is that translates the MDB methodology into ADB language, into ADB processes, and does give the answers to actually most of the questions that we are regularly being asked. For example, this one, you would be able to find the answer there. We highly encourage you, if you lead a project or if you're a climate change team member, to keep that as a reference and look it up there. But now, going to the specific question, all types of things that are considered a operation by ADB are need to have a Paris alignment assessment. Now, this means the usual investment operations. It's okay to show the answer now, also so I don't get it wrong. So it's everything where we invest money, essentially. PAs and the different facilities that I mentioned here do not need to be assessed. Some of them lead to further investments down the line. Those further investments down the line then, of course, need to be assessed for Paris alignment. So it is wise in the case of SEFFs or PRFs to already consider the question of Paris alignment, because you don't want to go into a direction there that you wouldn't then be able to execute later. But in principle, for their approval, they don't need the assessment.
Thank you so much, Christian. So that's just the beginning of our FAQs. We have more later, but we'll pause for a minute and I'll turn over to Okju to also share her experiences. For the last 2 years, she's been doing a lot of PAA assessment with different project teams, and let's hear from her and hear her experience. Over to you, Okju.
Thank you so much, for the first question and answer. So, of course, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. When the Paris alignment came into effect, I was the climate change focal point for the Southeast Regional Department. And since the norm, I have transitioned into my current role as a sector focal for wood operations and also transport some energy projects. So today, I'm very happy to share my observations and the lessons learned from these experiences, and also to spark some new ideas. Because Christian already provided a very good overview, so no need to repeat. Initially, I thought when the Paris alignment screening process became mandatory, I thought there was some kind of concerns and also confusions or sometimes misunderstanding around the Paris alignment, which caused some worries from our TMCs and vision leaders and those who involved in the project process. But however, over time, the process, Paris agreement, alignment assessment, the process has become more straightforward, and I really think, and especially with the excellent support provided by this dedicated Paris alignment. So I'm also part of climate change team, but I'm also a user or kind of a recipient or beneficiary of this support. So using this opportunity, I really want to thank you all for all the excellent support. So now most of us know that obtaining Paris alignment screening process and the result is very prompt and efficient, making the process appear more like an easy task. If so, I think this webinar is an opportunity to think about not only what is the Paris alignment, but also why we need this PAA process. So first of all, I want to mention our RRP including the project and the plans section, already showcase that how this project aligns with various sustainable development goals, SDGs, 11, 13, and also ADB's operational priorities, etc. So projects and the programs for our operations that contribute to achieving SDGs or OPs are naturally and very likely aligned with objectives of the Paris alignment. This was my basic assumption. But in that case, so why this extra step? So in my view, maybe this is a personal perspective, but the Paris alignment process is not only or just about the screening or examining something, but also rather an opportunity to place our project, our operations within the broader climate commitment or climate context of the countries we work with. So through elements like different BB1 criteria and also step 1, step 2, step 3, BB2, and the building blocks, the PAA process help us document and contextualize the project within a country's climate setting. So for us, this is additional opportunity for additional learning. This step ensures how we remain focused on the larger climate context of a specific country or specific city or specific region in the continent. And even when our projects are already designed to meet SDGs or OPs in an excellent. Of course, for some types of project, it is more complex, going beyond just documentation, for example. So taking some pure example, a project must meet both BB1 and the BB2. And this dual requirement can add complexity to the project design. Taking an example of a project focusing on rehabilitation of older buildings, residential or the public, aiming to improve energy efficiency. The project itself, targeting energy efficiency and the rehabilitation, is an excellent project. But to meet the Paris alignment requirement, this project may need additional measures for addressing adaptation. So to make sure the project improve not only just the energy efficiency mitigation, but also considers and integrating the specific responses to the identify the climate risk like the temperature increase, the drought, and the water shortage, etc. So particularly in this case, the Paris alignment process is not that simple if the project is already at the relatively later stage of project development processing. We saw those similar cases. And another example is the road project. I think Christian and Ryan will delve into further later through Q&A, I think, because these are one of the most frequently asked questions. It is very clear now with road project, everyone knows that we have to include the climate proofing measures to meet BB2, but road project particularly, they have to also incorporate those kind of BB1 measure, mitigation measures like the decarbonization of the sector or the road network, where possible, construct or providing charging stations or the policies or design standard related to or the decarbonization or public. And also, we could mention another project case for digitalization, another transport project, a project aiming to digitalize railways and involve purchasing IT, hardware, and the software applications, as well as supporting their operations in an indoor environment. So therefore, the project was not exposed to physical climate risk, and climate risk impact of the project was very minimal or even insignificant. So PAA process was quite very straightforward, and even higher loan amount was considered mitigation finance, and even CCA we skipped climate assessment. So having said that, we are already very much familiar with the Paris alignment, but maybe we can have some areas that we can have a further discuss. As you already mentioned, so for example, TRF or small expenditure financing facilities, SDFF or TA loans, we don't need to prepare even CCA, we don't need to account the climate finance, and we don't need to go through Paris alignment screening process. But these are very clear. We had some cases back and forth to discuss how we can apply or whether we have to apply this Paris alignment for those facilities or modalities. It's very much now cleared. But there are some categories of a project which could be case by case. For example, as you mentioned already, for BB2, for those the project with medium or high climate risk under the BB2 screening process. So just the question is how we can assess the climate risk and how we can assess the Paris alignment in relation to the climate risk. For example, PBLs earlier, PBLs is just a PBL policy-based loan or any financial sector project which do not involve infrastructure or civil works were initially considered as a low risk. But now the way that we are handling those modalities is evolving. So for example, PBL, even focusing on, for example, water or housing mortgages, the climate risk of the project could be or should be medium or high, although this is PBL. And in this case, the project, this is require more advanced screening process. So all these kind of different project case require us to be more flexible, and also just my understanding is PAA is an integral part of our climate due diligence. So yes, this is what I wanted to highlight and share. So again, I want to, in closing, I want to underscore that our approach to Paris alignment is evolving as climate risk increases. So to most our approach, so the way that we handle the PAA requirement is becoming, in a sense, I think, more systemized, but also more rigorous and context specific, ensuring that we situate project within a wider and a more integrated climate framework, both in terms of both adaptation and mitigation. So what just want to say is we can say broad in our thinking and more rigorous in our approach and attentive to a specific climate context in which we operate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Okju, for that very useful insights. I would like to reiterate what you have said about how the PAA is an opportunity for us to actually change our mindsets internally within ADB to actually really focus on the reason why we're doing this, right? And also an opportunity for us to convince our clients, the people we talk to in the different countries So yeah, there's a lot of things that we can still do. So thank you for those insights. And now we open the floor to some questions. If you have any burning questions, so for the remaining time, we'll be answering more of your FAQs, but we also welcome immediate questions that you may have. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and come on mic. If you're shy to talk, you can also use the chat box and just simply type in your question.
But it's much welcome if you want to raise your hand and come in and speak. Usually context is important, so we understand your question and best address it. Maybe really thank you to Oktu while you're thinking about questions. Thank you to Oktu for giving this perspective that's both informed by the process of how we got here, but also a lot of interaction with the operations and experience there. So thank you very much for that. And let me also take the opportunity to recognize our team members here. Tongs is with us, working with us on a TA, where we help to bring Paris alignment considerations into our upstream work with countries and CPSs. Jojo, our other consultant working on this, is online. And with us here in the room is Ryan, who I hope all of you know as the primary contact point, who will always answer your questions when you drop it to our joint email box. A fantastic group of people who've been extremely busy and hopefully useful to our operations colleagues. As you're thinking about questions, I just want to say, completely agree on the overall notion that Paris alignment is not about checking these boxes, but about opening these opportunities for us to talk about climate in each and every operation. Does it fit within the country's plans for climate transition? Does it entail any transition risks? Does it create potential stranded assets? Is it resilient to climate change, and is it supporting the overall resilience of the country? So these are conversations we are now regularly having across all of our operations, and therefore also much more in the upstream realm. So we're seeing that effect, for example, because what's coming to us now at approval stage usually doesn't entail the kind of gray zone questions anymore than what we encountered on the same kind of methodology, using the same kind of methodology when we applied it completely fresh to a legacy portfolio. Second reflection also is that our work on Paris alignment is being recognized by our member countries, by our shareholders, especially our transparency around the Paris alignment assessments was highly requested. We're doing this because it makes sense from a climate perspective, but we're also doing this because our shareholders want us to do this. And I'm aware of several instances at other MDBs where a project frankly crashed and burned at the board because they didn't do Paris alignment right. We have so far avoided any kind of such situation and have not even gotten any significant negative comments on Paris alignment here. So thank you very much to everybody really for going in the same direction.
Thank you, Christian. And having there are no questions from our participants at the moment, so we can perhaps go through the questions that we have curated for you. So our next frequently asked question is, who is responsible for undertaking the Paris Agreement alignment assessment? Is it project teams? Is it the climate focus? Christian?
Well, easy answer. No, so this is somewhat, the underlying question of this, of course, is how are things done in general now under the NOM, right? And it is in principle very clear that the project owner, meaning the operations department preparing the project, the team leader, is responsible for assessing the project for Paris alignment and documenting it in the climate change assessment, for example, in the format of the template that will be part of the RRP. So the operations team that puts it forward through the president to the board signs off on this and is responsible for preparing. There's no inter-depth review anymore in ADB, but of course we have now also climate change team members in each project, either in lead, supporting, or co-lead, or several categories in any case, and who perform core climate change functions and projects. That would include guiding on Paris alignment. All of the climate focals, all of the climate change team members know that we have this core group leading on Paris alignment, and we regularly support and are very happy to support individual operations. So we're not going to write the climate change assessment for Paris alignment assessment for operations for each case, but as soon as something becomes more complex, we can jump in and work together. In my experience, that's worked quite well. But of course, always happy for suggestions on how to improve any of these processes.
Moving on to our next question. How are the caveats to the university aligned list applied? So earlier you mentioned about having this list. This is particularly talking about source of energy coming from the grid affected by the caveats.
Yeah. So this goes into a little bit of detail, which probably is hard to understand without the context. The universally aligned list has this list of, for mitigation, things that are automatically aligned. It does contain a couple of caveats that all cover questions of whether or not something significantly relies on or the economic viability relies on the use of fossil fuels or otherwise not aligned activities in its operations. Now, that the universally aligned list must be read in conjunction with the caveats. So, if you have a data center that is powered by a specifically built coal power plant next door, that'll be an issue. And if you have a factory that's run by not your project, but your factory is run by new fossil fuel energy sources, then we have to look into that. But for example, the question of how your electricity that may be used in the project is produced in the country when it comes from the grid is not within the scope. So there we look at the scope of the project and the impact it can have, and the choices it can have directly impact. It's not neatly defined, but for the reason that these cases are usually a bit more complex and do need to consider context. And so we highly encourage you to reach out to the Paris alignment team if you encounter something like that. Important to note, again, that the universally aligned list is merely a list that speeds up or simplifies the process, right? So if your project is on the universally aligned list, but is caught by one of the caveats, it doesn't mean it's not aligned. It just means it has to go through the specific assessment, again, looking for consistency with climate plans of the country, transition risk, and compatibility with low carbon development plans and stranded assets.
Right. Thanks, Christian. On to our next question. And again, to our participants, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to chime in. So our next question is about buildings. So how can buildings be considered universally aligned?
And I take the liberty to passing the question to you, Ryan.
And I think the answer is already there. but yes,
you've been much more in depth.
Sure. So in the universally aligned list, we actually include buildings, but the condition is it has to be a green building certified. So at the moment, there is no certification for ADB green building certification for ADB. So usually in practice, what we do is we consider the certifications that countries would have. But as of the moment, this is an area that the team is trying to work on to come up with a standard for buildings in general, for ADB projects, so that whenever we go to our clients, to the different countries, we already have these conditions, this sort of standards for all projects that would include infrastructure or buildings. I hope that's clear enough. Anything you would like to add, Christian?
Yeah, I would just like to say that it's an extremely complex topic that goes across sectors, goes into national certification and standard setting, into industry standards, and so on. So it's not something easy to do, but of course, we see value in working towards a ADB view that could be a collection of principles with regards to building standards. But right now, yes, we are relying on national certifications and essentially a bit of a sense check and look at alternatives on, in practice, have we considered, possible upgrades sufficiently or not? That's usually the kind of reality in which we work.
Thanks. On to our next question. Do all components need to be aligned for an operation? I think this was already answered, so we can skip this one. Obviously, Christian mentioned earlier that all components need to be aligned for an operation. So for the next question.
In practice, Ryan, I think that's actually now in the case studies that we sometimes use in the trainings that's comes up. So say you have two infrastructure components and one TA or one capacity building component, and one of the infrastructure components is on the universally aligned list, the other one isn't, and then there's a capacity building component. What you would do in practice is not worry about the first one anymore. That's that's on the universally aligned list, and then run the second one only through the specific criteria. And then usually the capacity building component is also universally aligned. So you do differentiate by components. Again, there's no the MDB group, for good reason again, didn't exactly specify how this is supposed to be done, because the operational realities of each bank are different, and it's very hard to come up with common definitions. But usually in ADB, different components are useful delineator to be able to process things in an efficient manner when it comes to this question.
Okay, thanks for that additional insights. And on to our next one. What is the level of stringency in interpreting climate policies, considering that most are broad and ambiguous? I think this is about alignment with climate policies.
Yeah. So if we look at the first two questions in the specific assessment is it not inconsistent with climate plans in nationally determined contributions? The second one is the same with long-term strategies. The formulation is weird if you look at the guidance note and at the principles, but it is there for a reason. Because the reality is that the NDCs and LTSs, so the plans of the countries, are often not very comprehensive, meaning they might not cover your type of project, and they're often, or sometimes also not very ambitious. So we cannot say we only do operations that are in the climate plans or consistent with the climate plans of a country. Because the climate, if you say you build a school, but the climate plan of a country only talks about energy and transport, we obviously are not going to say, then we don't build a school, right? But so for that reason, the formulation is not inconsistent with, meaning that if we're not contradicting the climate plans, it's okay. Likewise, the specific assessment flow through which, say, 40–50% of the projects go are 6 questions. They're all formulated in this kind of negative way, and they all need to be answered with a yes. So say if we don't have applicable climate plans, if we don't have applicable global kind of pathways, but then we can still have a view on the low carbon transition and the stranded asset risk, for example, of that operation. So in that way, this multi-criteria assessment and framework that the MDB group came up with is useful because it attacks the same topic from different angles, if you will, and always, in our experience, allows us to make a difference.
All right, so we're almost on the hour. So this is our last chance for our participants if they have questions, if any. Otherwise, we'll go to our final question for today. But of course, beyond this session, you can always come to us, the Paris Alignment team, for questions that you may have. I don't see any raised hands. Okay, so I guess everything is super clear, I hope. So on to our final question on roads. You briefly mentioned about this. What are the conditions about roads? What are, usually there are like 2 requirements for roads to be, and Christian is passing it on to me. Okay, so yes, so for roads, there are 2 conditions that would make them aligned. So 1, they should consider low carbon construction. So meaning it's towards the end. So meaning they have to consider low carbon construction materials and low carbon construction methodologies. And then the second condition is that they should also contribute to the broader or overall decarbonization of the transport sector. And how can they do that? It could be hard infrastructure, meaning they have to integrate maybe e-mobility considerations, provisions for public transport and active mobility, or they may also consider capacity building or a TA that would try to cover decarbonization of the transport sector overall.
So maybe to round that topic off, roads have been a very complex subject under Paris alignment among the MDBs, as well as within ADB. It's clear that in most circumstances, in current situations, roads induce traffic. Traffic is generally fossil fuel intensive, and therefore has a climate impact there in terms of the greenhouse gas contributions. But the roads don't generate greenhouse gases by themselves, right? So that's why the way to look at it from a Paris alignment perspective is to look at the physical construction, basically your scope 1 and 2, if you will, in greenhouse gas accounting logic, and optimize that from a climate perspective, and then look at the contract. So is the country doing, so for the broader contracts, is the country undertaking sustainable transport measures? Do they have plans for that? Can we, as ADB, either in this project or in this country, in this region, do more? Or are we already doing something in an auxiliary way to improve low carbon development in the transport sector? And does the design of our particular intervention consider something like differentiated tolling, building charging station as part of the road, bus lanes, bikeability, and so on. So meaning, is our road, if we build one, designed in a way that it functions well in a low carbon transport future. So that's what we like to make sure with that in order to respond to the requirements. And just taking 1 second, because I see that our other team member, Emmanuel Feliciano, is also online. So you can see her picture there and her name. So she will also sometimes go up as your counterpart on Paris alignment assessment. Just wanted to get a quick shot.
Thank you so much, Christian. And that's the end of our FAQ session on PAA. I'd like to give this opportunity for closing statements from Oktu and Christian. Oktu, would you like to say final or closing statements?
Thank you so much again for this opportunity, and I really hope to be open. And also, the Paris alignment is kind of agreement between ADB and our DMCs. So DMCs, when we discuss with them on the specific and non-carbon, they are asking what is the Paris alignment and why we have to incorporate these measures in our program to implement it through our kind of. So I hope that all the due diligence of ADB, regarding Paris alignment, I don't say here, but we want to expand our effort to support the TMCs for their understanding of this.
No, and building on that, we do see that as the most impactful and sustainable way of course, bringing these notions into our operations to work with our countries more broadly on this. In fact, we had a lot of engagement with the Pacific early in the year. I was just in PRC to have early conversations on how we bring Paris alignment considerations into the country partnership strategy there. Jojo, who's online and part of the team, is on his way to Armenia next week to work with the country office and the government there as they're preparing for their country partnership strategy. So these are conversations we are now having, bit by bit, country by country, as they're preparing their engagement with ADB, so that the upstream pipeline that comes to us is Paris aligned and it's not a compliance exercise and take notes at the end.
So we can approach you and the team when we need any support for our teams.
Yes, absolutely. We have resources in place for CPS development, but also for any country programming discussions that you might maybe encounter. One last point on, we have regular clinics in several sectors, energy, sometimes transport, sometimes mostly transport and energy, but we can have any where it's kind of an open mic session where you can come in, ask questions, present cases to discuss them with the team, with your peers, or just listen in on Paris alignment and the specific sector. So look out for announcements.
Right, so
Thank you very much.
There you have it. Thank you so much, Oktu and Christian. This has been your moderator, Ryan, and I hope this session has been helpful for you. Thank you very much for participating and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Bye.